Threads of revolution are woven with the fabric of human resilience. Today, we confront a pivotal moment in the Spice Isles' journey. What compels a society to fracture and realize the threshold between aspiration and anarchy? How do we glimpse the resilience that defines a people?
Very substantial number of people in our country had decided that the time had come to fight back, that there was no more point in running and ducking.
Welcome to Resilience of the Spice Isle. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for joining us. In our last episode, Dr. George Bell presented a philosophical view of what led to the demise of the revolution. This week, our guest will continue in that vein as they navigate the waters, seeking the currents that led to chaos. We shall begin with an extract of a discussion that occurred in CBC studios in October 1983, immediately after the assassination of Maurice Bishop. The discussants were Dr. Francis Alexis, Pat Emanuel, Reverend Alan Curtin. The moderator was Milton Gibbs.
Francis, just a little while ago, was mentioning the reasons behind this whole scenario that we've seen enacted in Grenada. And I believe, Francis, you were saying it boils down to a difference of ideology. Am I right in assuming that?
There are other inputs, no doubt. But one cannot underestimate, for example, the basic human instinct for power, quote, simply wanting power, pure and simply. But you could say that at the end of the day, really, it was a question of ideological differences. In that, whereas, as it is now said, Bishop had a humanistic approach to the revolution. Code had what I would call a bestial approach to the revolution. Now, that is a difference of ideology. There's nothing more than ideology in that. An ideology is a system of beliefs, I would define it, as to how you run a state. And if one man thinks he should run the state humanistically, holding back the troops, using the troops to protect the people, and another man thinks, no, you should use the troops to shoot down the people. What else can there be in that than ideology?
Let's just call it philosophy, because it's just a play on various kinds of words, and outlook, and attitude, and disposition towards people, and personality traits, etc. All these things go up to make the totality of a person and his attitudes towards government, how to organize a government, and how to organize a party, which is a very important factor in the situation, as well as what policies you pursue. And there have been fundamental differences. One of the reasons why the NGM never declared itself to be a Marxist-Leninist party, a term that one has to use as distinct from the broader term of socialist party, the term that Bishop preferred to use, is precisely because of this fact. The Cubans had to deal with that problem in 1959, and in 1961, Castro declared that he was or is a Marxist-Leninist, and then that led to certain purges and changes and consolidation of the Cuban the party, which was not then called, it wasn't called anything at all, it was the guerrillas. It became, after a long time, the Cuban Communist Party. It was called two other things before that, between 1959 and 1965 or somewhere thereabouts. So that there have been fundamental differences of outlook. You know, there have been differences of outlook between Castro and Guevara. You know, between Mao Zedong and other people in China, in the Soviet Union. I mean, there are differences of outlook that might be described as Leninist on the one hand, Trotskyite on the other, revolutionary, democratic, etc. Within the general vocabulary of socialism itself, there are very definite strands, if you like, that can be identified that amount of fundamental differences that can cause people, as they have, to kill one another.
The revolution is facing challenging times. Tension is on the rise.
When it came down to the final analysis, we ended up, again, we're making international news. US-led invasion intervention and the assassination of a prime minister. The lead up to this, there are a lot of different sides to the story, of course. There were some economic challenges. But when you look at it in hindsight, you really wonder if they were overambitious, one, biting off more than they could chew, two. In hindsight, again, looking at the situation, they were really very young. You had persons in these positions of power, with the exception of probably one or two who had not yet turned 40. Yeah? So we're talking about people in their 20s and early 30s, taking on the reins of power and trying to make a whole lot of change in a very short period of time. And there's positivity in that, but sometimes someone with a little bit more experience, a little bit more knowledge could have guided the process a little better. One of the flaws, again, was letting the ideology take over as opposed to recognizing that we live in a Caribbean reality. And a Caribbean reality may not necessarily work very well with a pure Marxist, for example, ideology. You have to kind of tweak it to suit us. And that was one of the flaws. So, for example, the economy, it was argued that the economy was slowing down, there was not enough money to do all the projects that they would have wanted to do. The airport was almost finished. By the time the US landed, the airstrip was done. The buildings were not yet up, but the airstrip was actually done. So that major part of the project was completed. There was a lot of work in infrastructure, building roads, a whole system of feeder roads to get agricultural produce from the farmers to the port. And it was felt that there was not enough finances to do all the things that they wanted to do in that, as I said, a very short period of time. So they felt an economic crunch at that point by '83. There is the outside noise, if you want to call it that. Of course, the US was never happy or comfortable with Grenada as a socialist nation. That was very clear. The rhetoric that Grenada would have been spewing was not helping, but it was the reality of the time. We would have shifted in terms of starting to sell things like our nutmeg and so. It hadn't shifted totally, but there were shifts into moving into socialist countries, whether it was the USSR itself, and having all of those links, which the US was not comfortable with. And we do have evidence of maneuvers being done by the US in preparation for the possibility of an invasion at some point. There's Amber and the Amberdeens, for example, as one of the ways. President Reagan was very clear that it's not nutmeg that's at stake, it's US national security. Of course, because the idea was that the building of the international airport had to do with the establishment of a military base. And Grenada's geographical position, we are the closest outside of Trinidad to South America, and that possibility of us being used as a military base is one of the arguments that the United States would have used. The implosion of the revolution, I don't think had anything to do with the US. We had our own issues that causes the revolution to die from within. The US coming in, we created the situation, and it was the perfect opportunity to fix what was wrong. There's a lot of controversy as to the fixing. We ended up in a situation where there was the major bone of contention became the issue of joint leadership. And it basically split the Central Committee and wasn't in half either, with a majority going towards Deputy Prime Minister Cord and the minority staying with Bishop. And the theory behind joint leadership was trying to marry the strengths of both individuals. They were very different individuals. Bishop being the very charismatic leader that will speak for hours and people will sit and listen to him. Bernard Coard being the strategist and the tactician and the person who is going to get the economy running. When you go back to some of the records and you look at our conversations with the World Bank and the IMF, you're seeing them saying, we're on track. Yep, Grenada is pretty much doing well within the context of the early 1980s in such a small economy, that the economy was actually doing quite well. And you have to give Coard the props for that, because that was his area of expertise. But he is not the charismatic leader that Morris was. So the thought was, if you could marry the strengths of both, and rather than have Prime Minister and Deputy, you have joint, two leaders. I think that's where we throw out our Caribbeanness and we forget that within the Caribbean context, we have a way of idealizing our leaders. We tended to see prime ministers, the person as opposed to the party, and it's always a single person. I think M.G. Smith, sociologist, would have described it very well. He wrote a book called The Hero and the Crowd, where he speaks about that interaction that we have as a Caribbean people towards that one person. Yep. And that's exactly what happened in Grenada. We were no different. The revolution was Morris, and Morris was the revolution, period.
But let me just say too that they work hand in hand, and they work even leading up before 1983. Bernard and Morris share. Every time Morris made a major presentation before he traveled, they exchanged notes. So they knew what was happening. Bernard knew every move that Morris was making, every major presentation. It was being vetted. The information, or paper or document was being vetted. And there was a classical case, and this is from Bernard Coard, the Grenada Revolution. He wrote the book, The Grenada Revolution. When they met delegation as one. But there was a turning point when they went to Cuba. And when they went to Cuba, they went together, and Fidel Castro, at that meeting, indicated he wanted to meet the head of state. Now, that statement, I believe, created a serious rift, because he wanted to meet the head of state. So all along, Bernard and Bishop exchanging notes. All along, they met delegations jointly, but for that moment, Fidel Castro refused to have that high delegation meeting with Bernard Coard. This was probably one of the most humiliating things for Bernard Coard, who knew he wielded 100% influence over Morris. And it's from that time, the strategy unfolded, unveiled as much as possible. And so Bernard Coard was left outside while Bishop and Fidel Castro spoke one-to-one. From that time, the relationship between Bernard Coard and the Cubans went helter-skelter. And it shows because in coming back to Grenada, Bernard Coard started making overtures to the Kremlin. Bernard Coard started isolating, or his guys on the ground start recognizing that there might be a problem in trusting the Cubans. So that's what unfolded. Now, there was a situation where the revolution, high command, recommended or requested military hardware from Russia. And Fidel Castro advised against that level of hardware. They did not want to give the American reason to believe that the airport was going to be used as a base. Fidel Castro thought that the level of weapon demanded by the Grenada Revolution was not necessary in order to have the defense of the Grenada Revolution. But the Russians was prepared to send it. Now, in order to send the weapon, he had to go through Havana because there was no direct port to send it to Grenada. The Cubans advised against having that weapon shipped to Grenada. So when he reached to Cuba, the Cubans refused to send the weapons to Grenada. That relationship between Fidel and Bernard Coard got very, very, very sour. And the people that was the high command also start isolating Risso. Am I pronouncing him? Risso. He was the Cuban attaché, the Cuban ambassador to Grenada. His direct instructions from Fidel Castro that the only person that can command him for the Cuban troops to act was Maurice Bishop. So when Maurice Bishop was arrested, Risso couldn't have a one-to-one with Maurice because they isolated them. So these were some of the interplay that took place. Yeah, that was some of the interplay that took place. But Fidel think that he would only take command from the head of state. And that was the biggest blow to Bernard Coard's ego. And he created a rift from there onward. So you found now that the Grenada Revolution started looking for support from the Kremlin because they wanted to bypass Cuba because Cuba recognized Maurice Bishop and only Maurice Bishop as head of state. So the whole idea of having the so-called joint leadership and is a reaction that Bernard Coard too must be considered as head of state. And so the whole drama in the suggestion of Bernard having joint leadership or trying to replace Bishop, etc., was all because it started because of that bruised ego from Bernard Coard.
As tension continues to escalate, the unfolding events prompt us to ask the following questions. What is occurring? And what accusations are being leveled against Prime Minister Maurice Bishop?
So Maurice is accused on several occasions of lacking in ideological clarity. You would hear that all the time. Part of the reason, part of the criterion for your membership of this body is that you have to show a clear understanding and internalization of Marxism-Leninism or Stalinist theory. The problem with that is that our political culture is mass-based, large political parties. And this political culture is elitist.
One of the best books on the Grenada Revolution, simple, small, but very clearly spoken books called The Assassination of Maurice Bishop, makes clear. You know, these revolutionary councils, for all of their revolutionary talk, they essentially were the remnants of the upper class, dynamic with new ideas, of course. But he mentions in this book that at the height of the revolution, the council was there were only 2 working class members within the council. The rest were all the kind of educated academic bourgeoisie, in a way.
And they began to argue that the source of all the problems is Comrade Leader. He was being seen as the main source of all the problems that the party was encountering by September, October 1983. My view, it is not quite that. My view is that the party Politburo was grappling with, one, the small size of that central directing force of the government, because membership of that elite body was so difficult to achieve. You had to be checked, all kind of things about you. You have to be checked to see what your ideological leanings and stuff like that. And membership of this body was a very slow process. In the meantime, the country has to deal with all them issues. And people begin to complain of overwork and stuff like that because they did not have the adequate physical personnel to address them.
And then this began to crack things from early on, is this intense personal jealousy that Cord had against Maurice Bishop. The thing is that on the surface they would appear to be together, but Cord had all the theories and all the ideas and sort of the textbook revolution, but he did not have that street popularity that Bishop had. Bishop was handsome, tall, loved by everyone, and this really grated on Cord.
So the power struggle that ensued, it is believed, it is fueled by one Bernard being the strategist. He was a much better planner. He was mainly in the background. He was the one that was able to execute the more intricate planning in how to build the party. As I said, Maurice was the spiritual leader. And as a team, they worked extremely well. One in the background, strategizing, he was the strategist of the party. And the other one as the face-off and the spiritual and the psychological connection with the people, because Bernard Cord didn't have that kind of connection, while Maurice had it. But I believe what rubbed off eventually, that Bernard Cord felt that he was the one that was doing all the work. Maurice was being the one that got the praises. You know? So I said Bernard Cord and family. It is assumed that in the background, pure rumor, I have no way of verifying that. Bernard Cord wife felt that Maurice was inferior in terms of intelligence and academic excellence, and so she pushed that Bernard should not be second fiddle to Maurice. Again, I have no way of verifying that, but that is rumor. But I can see from all indication, from all the interaction, it seemed like he started removing some of the support under Maurice.
During that period of time, there were these gaps, these cracks were beginning to appear behind the scenes. And what made it even more difficult is when Bishop went to St. Kitts in 1981, in June 1981, and joined the others in creating the OECS. There's a famous photograph of them on the steps of the government headquarters in Bastia. And there's Eugenia Charles and all the other leaders or their representatives with the formation of the OECS. And in a way, Cord believed that Bishop was breaking that solidarity. Cord did not want the revolution to be diluted by this kind of interaction with who were considered to be conservative leaders. But you see, at that time, in the 70s, I was a member of the Dominica House of Assembly. I was a member of the Dominica Freedom Party with Ms. Charles. In fact, the opposition, the government used to call me Ms. Charles's little white boy, right? And I used to work very closely with the party and organize meetings and go everywhere. And the thing is that it was clear that, as I said, Cord was worried that Bishop was now leaning more towards being a group with these people, whereas Cord wanted this sort of idealistic, separate, almost experiment that he was going to prove to the world, as Castro did in Cuba, that this was a textbook revolution for a small island state. This is how you were going to run a small island state. And bit by bit, of course, the gaps became bigger and bigger because through the OECS, Bishop had to link so much with the other governments and these people. And they themselves, whether it was Compton or by that time Mitchell and others, they had these leftist groups leaning under the... So they were dealing with a very unstable situation.
And that instability continued to manifest itself. The envisioned partnership in leadership remained elusive. Rather, it was not to be.
So that marriage that they were asking for was not realistic. When it was brought to the Central Committee in September of '83, Maurice's reaction was one of feeling a vote of no confidence in him, and understandably so. Eventually, it was decided, all right, well, if that's what everybody else is thinking, let's go with this. And he went with it. left Grenada, went to Eastern Europe, returned to Grenada early October and said, no, changed his mind. So he reneged on a decision that was made at the level of the Central Committee. And that's when things started to slide, because he said yes, and he changed his mind, he said no. There's a whole theory as to why he said no. One of the theories is he had a chat with Uncle Fidel, and Uncle Fidel told him, listen, no, don't do that. As a theory. That there was a conversation, and it was felt that that was not the way to go. Whether this conversation happened or not, he said no.
In Cuba, Comandante, okay, Fidel Castro, charismatic leader, the man's get up and talk for hours. Everybody in Cuba said, bam, 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 Fidel. And Fidel, like Morris, and Morris passes through Cuba. And I believe that it is reasonable to think that Fidel will tell them that if you go this route where you talk about joint leadership, and Accord is the alternative, that the people ain't gonna go with Accord, they're gonna be disappointed that you're in the leader. And that gonna cause problems, so that you must resist it. But the way the Cubans dealt with a lot of things is that, I remember somebody said, they have some, I think somebody said that when they were dealing with Chavez, that Chavez had asked them a question about in Venezuela, if you got a problem, what do you do? The Cubans said, put 2 tanks there. That's how they solve it. Now, you have this visit of Morris to Cuba. By the time he gets back to Grenada, they say that he is not agreeing to what he had agreed to before.
Having said no, there is now a rumor that Accord is trying to kill him. And because of the rumor, he is placed under house arrest. And that's when everything turned old mass after that. Because you don't arrest the people's prime minister. And the Grenadian masses reacted. Strike, shut down the airport, demonstrations of all kinds, until eventually the largest of the demonstrations would have been to free Morris from house arrest.
Exactly what drives a society to splinter? And where is the fine line between aspiration and anarchy? This brings us to the month and the year that are so synonymous with the island of Grenada. October and 1983, as the situation worsened and descended into complete anarchy. It is from that point that we will continue the discussion next week here on Resilience of the Spice Isle. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for your time.